The 2004 collapse at Airport Charles de Gaulle. In both highly developed countries and those underachieving, public architecture is the showcase of national pride. In the early 2000s, the French proudly presented Terminal E of the Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, the masterpiece of architecture. Less than a year later, it became an embarrassment on a world-scale level. With Paris being one of the main European business centers and a famous tourist destination, Charles de Gaulle is one of the busiest airports in the world. The number of passengers passing through it is over 50 million per year. For all of them, Charles de Gaulle is the first impression they get of France. It is the mirror of the nation. That was the reason Aéroports du Paris Group invested 750 million euros in building a new terminal for international arrivals and departures. A renowned French architect, Paul Andreu, was hired for the job. Andreu, already famous for designing other terminals at the same airport and many other airports worldwide, was a guarantee of success. Indeed, when the terminal was opened in June 2003, it seemed like nothing similar was made in the history of airport architecture. With its futuristic look, Terminal 2E was a breathtaker. Both experts and the public were full of praise for Andreu's design. However, hardly any of them believed their eyes when on May 23, 2004, they saw news reports of the terminal lying in rubble. This latest word in architecture collapsed on its own, killing 4 passengers and injuring many others. But how did it happen less than a year after it was built? Was it the architect to blame, or perhaps the constructors? Force majeure? After a thorough inspection was conducted, it revealed not only the culprits for the collapse of the terminal, but also deficiencies of the entire construction scheme behind it. It was the early morning of Sunday, May 23, 2004. Cleaning crews scattered across the Charles de Gaulle Airport, preparing terminals for the wave of passengers that were about to swarm up. The cleaning crew wiping the floor of Terminal 2E noticed strange dust on the floor. A moment later, they found out this was concrete dust scattering from the terminal's concrete ceiling. Cleaners immediately reported the case to their supervisors, who discovered that the fissures had appeared on the roof. The situation was alarming. The cracks that appeared meant the concrete roof was beginning to tear away from its steel supports. What airport officials failed to notice at that moment was that the construction had already begun collapsing. First, an underside concrete block on the shell of the building fell. Then, 90 minutes later, the northern concrete wall buckled and the struts holding it pierced through. Finally, the concrete roof lost support, and the first to collapse was the ceiling's edge beam. Luckily, the crowd at the terminal was far from that during peak hours. Still, passengers were arriving from the South African Republic, and the United States and several others were waiting for their flight to Prague. The airport officials and police officers began the immediate evacuation of the terminal, but it was too late. At 7 a.m., the concrete roof cracked and collapsed, burying dozens of passengers under the pile of concrete and glass. Airport rescue teams arrived at the scene in a nick of a moment. The effort to rescue the passengers was futile, as there was no way they could move heavy chunks of concrete. Only in the afternoon, they brought in a heavy crane to clear the site. Police rescue teams arrived with specially trained dogs to search for the bodies. It was a miracle that the collapse of several tons in the weight of concrete, steel, and glass ended with only 4 dead passengers, 2 Chinese citizens, one from Ukraine and another one from Lebanon. There were a lot of injured passengers, though. That the collapse happened in the early hours and not during the peak hours was the only reason the accident didn't turn into a full-scale tragedy. Along with rescue teams, on-site investigators arrived to determine the cause of the accident. A horrifying terrorist attack struck Madrid just 2 months before, and the French police immediately suspected the same happened at the airport. However, reports of witnesses confirmed it was a structural failure that caused the collapse. Explaining the accident by claiming that the building structure was poor was awkward for the project that cost 750 million euros and engaged one of the best French architects. Designing Terminal 2E was not Paul Andreu's first such project. What more, Andreu was the architect in charge of building the first terminal of the Charles de Gaulle Airport between 1966 and 1974. Over time, he designed several airports across the globe, such as airports in Shanghai, Manila, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. All of them are true masterpieces of airport architecture. Terminal 2E at Charles de Gaulle was his last airport job. Its design was as unique as it was ambitious. The terminal was a 450-meter-long elliptical tube resting on parallel, longitudinal beams. The perforated tube was built of 30-centimeter-thick reinforced concrete rings. The peculiarity of the structure was that there was no pillars inside to support it. Instead, Andreu applied the principles of tunnel construction by installing the outer steel frame to which concrete rings were attached via struts. In this manner, both the external frame and concrete rings carried the weight of the structure and decorative glass panels. The construction looked futuristic and was very spacious since there were no massive pillars inside to impede the free movement of passengers. Andreu's design was truly innovative and impressive. However, for such a design to stay in place, it had to be built in perfect static balance. So, if the structure was so spectacular, how come it collapsed on its own? The Administrative Investigation Committee that investigated the accident cited two key factors that led to the accident. The first was the structural engineering failure. Simply said, the construction had several design flaws. The committee noticed that Andreu's design was on the edge of static balance. Terminal 2E lacked redundant supports, an otherwise standard construction feature added as a precaution measure in case one or more support fails. Terminal 2E had none, and when one support failed, it shifted the load to other supports, which ultimately led to a collapse. The committee also cited that supports failed in the first place because of their inadequate strength and low resistance to temperature changes. On the day before the accident, the temperature varied from 20 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius. It was too much of a stress for the weak outer frame. What more, the entire structure was labeled as having an inadequate capacity to resist stress. During 11 months of existence, the stress gradually weakened the structure until it finally collapsed. The second factor was the process failure. The firm that built Terminal 2E was the French public establishment Aéroports de Paris, ADP. The firm was in charge of both designing and constructing the terminal, which meant there was no outer control of how the project was carried out. To cut the expenses and shorten the construction period, ADP cut some corners and circumvented essential protocols such as detailed analysis of the structure. The committee also noticed that the external support frame was chosen based on its aesthetic appeal rather than on calculated engineering judgment. Instead of consulting the construction engineers, who had more than enough experience in such matters, the management of the ADP increased the pressure on them to finish the job earlier and at a lesser cost, which led to fatal mistakes in the construction process. The report of the Administrative Investigation Committee was entirely accepted by a court in Paris. They fined the Aéroports de Paris group with 225,000 euros for involuntary manslaughter. The court also fined engineering and inspection firms and subcontractors that took part in the construction of the terminal. The accident at the Charles de Gaulle Airport was a lesson for all architects across the globe. Ever since, when a new construction method was applied, it was done in consultation with all professionals involved in the construction process. More importantly, the accident emphasized the importance of all professionals working from the same script so that the plans and intentions are not lost in the transition from the design bureau to the construction site. In the end, losing 4 lives at the Charles de Gaulle Airport reminded us that professional ethics and care for people should always be above all other priorities. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please like and subscribe. See you next time.